I have a long history of interest in various kinds of denialism, vaccine denialism, evolution denialism, and more recently global warming denialism. And so I'm trying here from a philosophical point of view, but without getting into too much of the philosophical history, to explain a little bit about how I see the line between skepticism and denial. What is skepticism? Let's start with that. It's a long, noble philosophical tradition going back to the ancients. Broadly, you can think of it in terms of withholding cognitive commitments of some kind or other. Not believing or not taking the position that you know something, or so on. Contemporary skepticism, since Descartes really, at least in the modern tradition, focuses on justification and thinks about the justifications we have for beliefs. So knowledge skepticism holds that no belief is sufficiently justified to constitute knowledge. And if you have a really high standard for knowledge, say you want knowledge to really be certain, you don't want to say you know something unless it's absolutely certain, then you might say, no, you know, even 2 + 2 = 4 could go awry. Maybe I keep saying that and you keep hearing me say something that's wrong when I say that. And you're just being kind to me in sort of nodding when I say it. Justification skepticism is a lot stronger. You say, no belief is ever justified, or you say, no belief is ever better justified than another belief. This is sort of absolute relativism, which you do encounter sometimes. It's a startling sort of view, and it's hard to put into practice, I think, but it's a view that you'll find out there. Fallibilism. Here's a very modest view, and one that I think is pretty widely shared. It's actually fairly characteristic of what I'll call scientific skepticism a little bit later. Any belief we have, no matter how well justified, could later turn out to be mistaken. Now, this is a fact about the original Greek root of the word we have, skepticism, skepsis. And what it means is inquiry. So skepticism shouldn't just be about having doubts. It's also about the process of inquiry. And in fact, it was less about doubt and less about the whole issue of justification than about continuing to inquire and attending to contrary arguments for the ancients. They had found themselves in a bit of a mess by the time that skepticism emerged. They'd had some fairly intense discussions over 100 years or so, and then skepticism continued, of course, in the tradition thereafter. And they hadn't really managed to settle things. There were still lots of disputes, and people had arguments on both sides, and there were these crazy Eleatics, including famously Zeno of Elea, who had some arguments against the possibility of motion that they didn't really have a good answer to. And in fact, from a mathematical point of view, we didn't have a good answer to it until the late 19th century. So I think it was actually fairly brave of them to advocate that what we should do in response to this is to continue to inquire rather than give up, and rather than adopt some dogma in the meantime. So here's a use for skepticism. Sextus Empiricus, his 2nd century Common Era character, he proposed skepticism as a cure for philosophy and also a cure for dogmatism. He said we should suspend judgment about absolutely everything because everything can reasonably be doubted, one basis or another. And what he used in arguing for this position and in trying to get people to accept this position was paradoxes, like Zeno's paradoxes. There were quite a few on the table at the time, and counter-arguments. So we've got an argument from Plato for one philosophical view. You've got an argument from Aristotle for a different view. Maybe we shouldn't make the call. Maybe we don't have to make the call. Maybe we should just continue in kind of suspension. And Sextus said, look, once you reach this state of universal doubt, we can relax. We can stop struggling about these things we don't agree about, and that'll be just fine. Now, he also had a practical turn. He also said that in the meantime, you should act on appearances, which I think in part, gives you an excuse to act as though motion is real, since it certainly appears to be real and it helps you get along in the world. there were some skeptics who were so radical that they sort of refused to pay attention to their surroundings. And their followers would scuttle around trying to prevent them from falling off cliffs and things like that. At least these are the stories one hears. It'd be nice to have better documentation than we do. Justification, as I said, is the central theme of modern talk about skeptical worries. And so I thought I'd say a little bit about the structure of those. I'm pretty sure it's broadly familiar to people here, but the point is just this. The way we go about justifying assertions is we cite other claims as supporting evidence, and in effect, we endorse some kind of inference from those supporting claims to this conclusion that we're trying to justify. If you offer anybody a finite non-circular justification, and usually you get complaints if you don't offer a finite non-circular justification, you've got two gaps in the justification that you've offered. First of all, somewhere in there have to be some claims that you didn't offer a justification for. You just made them. And second of all, there are going to be inferences in there that you haven't defended. And so out of this fact about the way we do this thing we call justifying claims, we get regress arguments for a justification type of skepticism. If you rule out circular and infinite arguments, then the justification we have for any claim that we make depends on just accepting some supporting claims and inferences. Now, at this point, my students get the impression that I'm saying no claim is ever justified, that I'm endorsing justification skepticism. That's not really true. There are a few dodges we can pull, a few suggestions that can be made to try and escape the regress. Foundationalists say that some claims just are justified, period, and the same for some inferences. Coherentists say that the real justification for any of these claims is the place that they occupy in a system of claims which work out together, which mutually support each other. And pragmatic coherentists say that some of these claims actually have their roots in a practice where we spontaneously arrive at claims, and we do that in an intersubjectively agreed way so that we can all agree that this is a lectern I'm standing in front of. And those give us, if you like, more anchors in the practice we have of arriving at beliefs and at defending them, at justifying them in ways that we find agreeable. So let's talk a little bit about scientific skepticism. One of the main themes here is that we emphasize the importance of empirical investigation and the scientific method as sources of reliable beliefs. So this has a little bit of that pragmatic air I was talking about. We actually have practices. We have practices in labs for making observations, and you have to work hard to learn them, to set the equipment up correctly so that you get the best results, and so on. And history provides us, this is another interesting and striking fact, with many examples, something that the ancient Greek skeptics were worried about with respect to philosophy, and were right to be worried about, many examples of scientists who held incompatible views originally, but wound up in agreement. So agreement on the role of DNA in reproduction and inheritance, work by Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin as well, of course. Nebulae as other galaxies. There was a fair bit of debate in the early 20th century about whether nebulae were just clouds in the Milky Way, whether the Milky Way might really be the whole universe, or whether they were actually other galaxies far away. And this turned on the question of whether some of those bright flashes in nebulae, if they were faraway galaxies, they would have to be extremely bright, and that would mean there had to be supernovae. And it took astronomers a while to figure out that there really were supernovae that were much, much brighter than the usual nova. And theories of gravity. Of course, we've since settled on Einstein as opposed to Newton, with a little help from Eddington originally. Scientific skeptics broadly tend to avoid commitments to claims that don't achieve this kind of general agreement. Any claim that hasn't sort of been out there and tested by the community and broadly accepted is still in the air. It's not a settled thing yet. Now, we also employ various deliberate methods that are meant to reduce or eliminate biases. So obviously double-blind studies in medicine, okay? We control for placebo effect and physicians' expectations, and these days actually we have trial registries too, so you can't pick and choose which trials you publish. We look for replication and we look for cross-checking. I'll try to speed up here. Third point. Our sciences we have sciences now that have achieved previously unimagined levels of reliability, testability, and fruitfulness. So I think some of the ancient skeptics who, like Sextus Empiricus, were very pessimistic, might well be more optimistic about this kind of modest skepticism that I'm advocating here. But we're still broadly skeptical. I think we're fallibilists for the most part. We're pragmatists in that we value convergence and we value practical reliability of claims, and we hesitate at strong metaphysical truth claims for our conclusions. And as a result, we would say, well, classical mechanics is still pretty good physics, although you could say, if you like, it's entirely wrong, because the concepts, strictly speaking, don't apply to the world. Even in the cases of orbits that are perfectly well calculable that way, it's not the right theory of gravity. Denialists, I want to say, are not skeptics. Well, what do? They reject very well-supported claims. The Earth is about 4.54 times 10 to the 9th years old. There are vaccines out there, including MMR, that are safe and effective. There is such a thing as anthropocentric climate change. So you might ask, why isn't this just a kind of genuine, if extreme, form of the kind of scientific skepticism I've been proposing as reasonable? Well, I've got 2 points that I want to make. They apply their skeptical doubts very selectively, and their proponents aren't engaged in anything that's recognizable as inquiry, in the same way that science is a business of inquiry. So on selective versus rational doubts, here's a claim you might encounter occasionally. Climate scientists can't be trusted. They have to go along with their colleagues in order to be published and receive research grants. Well, what about politicians and think tanks who reject climate change and have ties to fossil fuel interests? It seems to me, you might say, they merit similar suspicions. Now, I think that it's right to say that if the first is justified by some high but non-gerrymandered standard of probity, then B is also justified by that same standard. And so an honest skeptic should either accept A and B, or perhaps accept B but not A, given the stakes involved for fossil fuel interests, and the low stakes involved, at least in personal terms, for climate scientists. Finally, it's not inquiry. If you follow the arguments that go on in that literature over time, you find fake skeptics skipping from issue to issue. I won't go into examples here, with not much regard for consistency. Broadly speaking, I think they treat these things like talking points, and talking points are sort of here today, gone tomorrow, here for this audience, gone for that audience. They will later repeat claims that have been agreed false. Duane T. Gish is famous for this in a couple of cases. They drop commitments that become inconvenient. Anthony Watt's commitment to accept the results of the best study is a nice example that comes to mind. Also, if you follow the argument from skeptic to skeptic, they disagree amongst themselves in general in pretty strong ways. But the disagreements don't get resolved. They aren't even addressed in their discussions, because their discussions are all aimed at arguing against the view that they want to deny. Or at least, I hesitate to say argue there, but leave it. So my claim is that fake skeptics aren't investigating anything. They aren't conducting inquiry. They are dogmatists defending a fixed position, which is denial of whatever it is that they're, quote, skeptical, unquote, about. I'll just say a little bit about C.S. Peirce. He's a kind of a hero of mine, a 19th century American philosopher, one of the great pragmatists, somebody who actually independently discovered the predicate calculus, which is sort of standard form of logic that's widely used today and that you can use to state mathematical theories and so on. In The Fixation of Belief, which is a fairly early paper, he said a little bit about doubt and inquiry. He said that doubt is uncomfortable and it leads to inquiry, and we persist, we continue to inquire until that doubt is replaced by some belief or other. Belief, on the other hand, he said, is comfortable. Once you believe something, it persists and you will act on it. He's a pragmatist, so the important thing about a belief is it guides what you do, until something disturbs it, until something comes along that makes you doubt it. Say somebody else telling you, no, that's not true, or your practical activities involving it going wrong. But it seems that Peirce missed something when it comes to this business about deniers. For deniers, it seems that doubt is the comfortable state. As a pragmatist, of course, he thought you needed to have beliefs in order to guide practical action in the world, But what deniers want to do, and this is my diagnosis of this little issue, what they want to do is block policy actions. And as a result, doubt is enough for them. That's all they need. So I'll leave it there.